Welcome back to Country Cow Designs. I'm Jo, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make this very cute little crossbody bag. This is our new sewing pattern, the Ojyma Crossbody bag. So you can grab the pattern from countrycowdesigns.com if you want to sew along with us. This is going to be a step-by-step tutorial to show you how this is made. Now the reason this is called the Ojyma Crossbody is because Amy Hutton of Bed Hog Shop Designs, she is on Instagram, you can check her out and make sure you follow her. She actually came up with the design of this bag, and she also came up with the name, which is Amy, Jo, our names backwards. So we were writing a pattern for a bag that was kind of similar to this, but it just wasn't coming together. I just really didn't like the design. So then I saw Amy's bag and I loved it. And I asked her if we could work together to create a pattern. She said yes, so this is the result. This bag is great for every day. It's got so many pockets. So on the front we've got this cargo pocket. We've got a unique little method for the pleats, which means it's not bulky because some cargo pockets get really bulky. On the back, we've got a little slip pocket with a magnet, and inside this double zip, you've got a zip pocket and a slip pocket. Now this is finished with binding because binding gives it great structure. It's kind of like having the skeleton of the bag, and it's really good for structure. So that's why we say that this is an intermediate pattern, because curves plus binding, you know, some beginners are definitely going to do it. I know you are, and some of you are going to do an amazing job on it. But we call it intermediate because it's going to be a little bit harder. So all of these are made on my domestic sewing machine, my Bernina 930, and that's the machine that we'll be using for the tutorial today. This one is made using foam, which is what we recommend in the pattern. You can see how sturdy and structured it is. This one is made using Decaville, and it's a little bit less sturdy, but still works great. So if you want to substitute it for Decaville Light, I know how a lot of you love Decaville Light, then you can go ahead and do that. Now, if you follow us on social media, you'll know that we've started doing makers boxes, which is where we provide absolutely everything you need to make the bag. All the fabric, stabilizer, hardware, everything. So we did it for this pattern, and this is the bag that you're going to end up with if you bought one of our makers boxes. They sold out pretty quick, but we will be doing them for future patterns as well. So if you are on our email mailing list, you will get notified when we do those. So in the video description, I will put links for all of the materials we've used for getting the pattern, for our email address. If you want any help with the pattern, just email us, and I'll also put the timestamps in there if you want to skip to a particular part of the video. So I hope you enjoy making this bag. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started. These are the fabrics that I'm using in this video. So for my exterior, I've got this peaches fabric for the pockets, and I've got, it's like a dry oilskin canvas basically for the main exterior. It's quite a lightweight canvas. Then for the little accent pieces, I have cork. Got my foam stabilizer for the main part of the bag, and then we've got Decaville Light for the flap. And for the lining, I've got this simple stripes fabric. I've got my exterior zips. I'm also going to use a number 5 zip for the interior. Got my binding, my hardware, and webbing for the strap. Step 1 is the strap and preparation. For this step, you're going to need your webbing, your strap hardware, and your 2 strap tabs. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark these down the center. So they're square, so you can mark it either way down the center. And then we're going to fold the long edges into that center line. Now this canvas is very difficult to mark, so I am actually just doing it by sight. Now, if you've got the right kind of fabric, you could just stick this down using a little bit of double-sided tape. I'm going to use clips instead. Now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch the 2 edges, and we'll do the exact same thing with this one. Throughout this pattern, we'll be using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance as standard unless stated otherwise. When we're basting and we're top stitching, we'll be using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once those are top stitched, you want to wrap them around your rectangle ring. Make sure that the join side is going to be hidden on the inside, and just clip that together. So I'm just going to baste the bottom edge closed, and I'll do the same thing with this one. Once those are basted, you just need to mark a line. Now you're marking it just down from the bottom edge of the rectangle ring. So that's the bottom edge and you're marking it down from there. So all the measurements are given in the pattern for all the marks that you need to make. This is going to make it a lot easier to get a nice snug fit later on when we fit these. Unfortunately, this canvas is really difficult to mark. So I have marked it, but it's not going to show up on the camera, I don't think. So the next step is an optional one. Now, if you want to, you can add little strap ends to your webbing. So if you don't want to add strap ends, we're just going to double fold it in every step like that so that the raw edge is hidden. But I like to add these little cork, or you can make them out of vinyl or leather or whatever you want, onto the end. So I'm just going to fit them using a little bit of glue. Now I'm going to take this over to the machine and I'm going to sew this open edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I'll do the same thing on the other end. Once those are both fitted, you want to wrap one around the center bar on this strap slider. So this is the point where if you didn't fit strap ends, you're going to want to double fold it so that the raw edge is hidden. Now I'm just going to fold it back by a little bit, not too far, maybe an inch or so, and then I'm going to fit 2 rivets here to hold this in place. Step 2 is the cargo pocket. For this step, you're going to need your lining and exterior flap pieces, your flap stabilizer, your lining and exterior cargo pocket pieces, and 1 exterior main panel. You'll also need one of your magnetic snaps. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to fuse the flap stabilizer to the lining piece, and you want to make sure it's absolutely centered when you do that. Once that's fused, use the measurement in the pattern to mark your magnetic snap, and then you need to grab one of your washers and you're just going to place that over the mark and mark those side slits. Now cut your side slits with a small pair of scissors. If you're using cotton for your fabric like I am, I recommend using a little bit of fray check on these slits just to make sure that they don't fray in the future. If you use fray check, make sure it's completely dry before you go on to the next step. So we're not actually going to fit the magnetic snap yet. What we're going to do is place these right sides together, and then we're just going to clip them on all edges. Now flip it over to the lining side. We're going to sew it from the top down and following around the stabilizer. So you want to have your needle just on the edge of the stabilizer, well, just off the edge of the stabilizer, and you're going to follow this line all the way around. This is going to give you a really nice, neat finish to your flap. Using a shorter stitch length on the curves will make it slightly easier to sew. But you'll have to bear with me on this tutorial because my Bernina is acting up, and there's a problem with the pedal, so it's kind of full speed or none at all. So just bear with me as I go around these curves. Okay, so once that's sewn, you just grab a pair of pinking shears if you've got some, and you can trim the seam allowance down. And what you can do is go around these curves. It's gonna help the curve to lay better. So don't go too close to your stitches, but just trim that down. If you don't have pinking shears, you can just snip into the corner in the same way, into the curves. So I'm going to turn this right sides out, and then I'm going to use my little turning tool to just push the curves out and get a neat finish. Once that's all turned out, we're going to top stitch this, and we're going to do that before we fit the magnetic snap because it can be a little bit trickier to do it afterwards. Okay, now that's top stitched, we're going to fit the male part of the magnetic snap. So what you're going to do is you're going to push it through the slits you made, and then on the inside you need to put the washer over the prongs. and then just fold your prongs back. Now a lot of people like to cover the prongs with like duct tape or something to protect this fabric. I don't tend to do that, but I'll leave that decision up to you. There we go. Okay, so the male part of the magnetic snap is this one with a little sticky out bit. Now we're just gonna baste the top closed and we're done with the flap. So set your flap aside for a minute, and the next thing we're going to work on is this exterior cargo pocket piece. So if you've got a right side up, you can decide on that now. I don't think this one really does. What I've done is I've marked the centers, and then I've marked the measurements from the pattern on the top and the bottom edge. So this first mark, the one closest to the center, we're going to fold the fabric wrong sides together. So what you can do is just make sure that the fold lines up there, and then that way you know you've got a nice straight fold. So I'm going to take that over to the iron, I'm going to press that, and I'm going to do the same thing with the mark on the opposite side. And I'm going to give that a good press as well. Okay, so I've pressed those folds. Now what I'm going to do is take them over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this one, but make sure that as you're doing it that the other fold is kept out of the way. Okay, so both of those folds are stitched. What we're going to do now is we're going to fold the fabric right sides together on the outer marks. So again, I'm just going to fold it like that and make sure it lines up at the top. And I'm going to take this over to the iron and press it and do the exact same thing on this side. So once those folds are pressed, you should have what's now starting to look like a cargo pocket. Now there's a good reason we're not doing the lining yet, so I'll show you that later. What we're going to do now is we're going to top stitch these folds on the sewing machine. Just pull them away when you top stitch to make sure that you don't go through the rest of the pocket. And the last thing for this exterior cargo pocket piece is just to baste these pleats down so that they won't move around. So we're going to do a similar process with the lining pocket piece, but the measurements are in different places and the folds are going to go the opposite way. So I've already marked mine up, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it on the marks furthest from the center. I'm going to fold the fabric wrong sides together and give that a press, and I will do the other mark that's furthest from the center too. So I'll press those with the iron and then I'll top stitch them. Once you've got those stitched, you're going to fold the fabric right sides together on the inner marks. So just like that. You can begin to see now how this is going to have pleats in a different place to the exterior piece. So I'll do the same thing again. I'll press it with an iron and top stitch those pleats, but I'm going to top stitch them from the back side. Once those back folds are stitched too, we're just going to baste the top and bottom to hold the pleats in place. Something we should have done earlier, but I completely forgot, is mark the magnetic snap on the exterior piece. So the measurements again are given in the pattern, and I'm going to place my washer over the top and mark the side slits. Now for this one, I'm also going to put a piece of Decaville behind it, or Peltex, because on the flat piece it already had Decaville behind it, but this one doesn't, and I want to make sure it's got a little bit of stability because there's not a lot for it to hold on to there. So go ahead and snip those marks, but we're not actually going to fit the magnetic snap just yet. Now we're going to place the lining and exterior cargo pocket pieces right sides together, and you'll notice that your pleats on the lining, they sit inside the pleats on the exterior piece. This is going to mean a lot less bulk when we're top stitching the pocket. So just clip that together, and we're going to sew that top edge. Now those are sewn together, I'm just going to press this top seam open with my iron. That will help me get a nice neat finish, and then I'm going to press it again once I've turned it over. Now that seam is nice and flat, I'm going to top stitch this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you reach the pleats, use a hump jumper to get over that extra bit of fabric. Okay, so now that that is top stitched, I'm going to fit my female magnetic snap. So I'm just going to push this through the slits that I made earlier. Then I'm going to put my little bit of Peltex, just make sure it's not going into the seam, and put the washer on. Now I'm going to baste the sides and the bottom with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, we're almost done with this cargo pocket. So make sure that you trim it as it's instructed in the patterns, because we want it to be slightly wider at the top than it is at the bottom. This will stop your bag from like creasing after it's fitted. Now you can measure from the top and mark your main panel as instructed in the pattern. That is where your pocket will be coming up to. So you want to make sure that it's meeting those marks. Now your pocket should be slightly wider than this main panel. As you can see, I cut mine slightly smaller by mistake, and it's now coming out slightly different. So what your pocket should be doing at the top, it should be wider. So when you match it to the marks, the pocket should be pushing out very, very slightly. And that's what stops the creasing when the bag's complete. So because I've got a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, I have got enough room to just move this in very slightly so it has the same effect. But this is easier if you just cut your panel the right size to start with. And then the bottom should match perfectly. Obviously mine doesn't, but it should do. So just clip the rest of the pocket in place. So flip your panel over and baste that pocket on from this side so that you can follow the curves at the bottom. To make sure that I don't end up with a wonky pocket, I am starting from the bottom center, and then I'm sewing up one side, and then I'm going to go back and start from the center and sew up the other side. This way, if my fabrics choose to stretch a little bit, they'll both stretch in the same direction. Once that's sewn on, you just want to flip it over, and we're going to trim the pocket curves so that it matches. Now you can grab your flap and you can connect the magnetic snap. Now you'll see that there's a little bit of a gap, so the flap is slightly longer than the main panel. That's how you want it to be. That again is so that this isn't kind of stretched and causing problems when the bag is finished. So what you need to do is bring it down so that it lines up. Now I've marked the center, I've snipped the centers on both the flap and the exterior so I can make sure that it's lined up perfectly. And I'm going to clip that into place. Now I'm just going to baste that. And that's your cargo pocket done. So I am loving this light and dark contrast going on in this bag. So yeah, I really like it so far. So let's move on to the next step. Step 3 is the exterior slip pocket. For this step, you're going to need one magnetic snap, your exterior slip pocket piece, your lining slip pocket piece, and the remaining exterior main panel. So be careful with these two pieces because they're not rectangular. Okay, they're longer on one edge and then they come in just a tiny bit for the bottom edge. So what I would do is just mark the top on each piece so that you don't get those messed up. And the first thing you need to do is mark your magnetic snap location on the lining piece and snip ready for fitting that later. So right now we're just going to put these right sides together. Again, make sure that you're matching up the top edges and clip those together. And now we're just going to sew that top edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to take this to the iron. I'm going to press that seam open on the top, and then I'm going to press it to get a nice neat edge on the outside. Now I'm going to top stitch that edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Grab the male part of your magnetic snap, and we're just going to fit that onto that lining piece where we made the slits. So again, I've got a piece of Peltex that I'm going to use, keeping it out of the seam there, but that's just going to help give that magnetic snap more to grasp onto. Now we're going to clip this together and we're going to baste the exterior and lining together. Similar to what I did with the other panel, I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way across and up from each side. This way, if my fabrics do stretch, they're both going to stretch in the same direction. If you start from here and work your way around, what you can end up with is it stretching in opposite directions and you get a kind of wonky pocket. Now grab your exterior main panel, place your slip pocket on top and match up the bottom center marks. Now, if you're following the pattern, you should have marked centers on pretty much everything at the beginning. This will just make it easier all the way through. So you want to make sure that your pocket is level at the top. Again, there is a measurement in the pattern for how far down you want it to be, so you can check that it's even on both sides. And now you're just going to push down hard on your magnetic snap. And what that should do is leave a nice indentation there. And then you can put your washer over that. Now, what you might want to do first of all is just check that this is completely centered on your panel. And if necessary, you can just move it slightly to the right or the left. Just make sure that's centered. And then we're going to mark the side slits for the washer. So I've cut my slits. I'm going to put the female part of the magnetic snap through there. Again, I've got a piece of Peltex to go on the back. You could use Decaville or fleece or anything that you've got really. And then I'm going to push the prongs down. So now we're just going to clip this pocket in place. And again, it should be slightly wider at the top than the panel that it's on. So it's going to kind of puff out in the center just a little bit. It's not a lot, it's just a little bit. It's going to make a big difference when the bag is finished, because otherwise, when it's all sewn in place, this panel will crease quite a lot. So just match up those edges and clip it in place. Make sure the measurement from the top to the pocket is the same on both sides, so your pocket is definitely straight. Flip it over, and we're going to baste that in place exactly like we did with the cargo pocket. Then I'm just going to trim these corners off. And that's your slip pocket all done. So set that aside and we'll move on to the next step. Step 4 is the gusset. For this step, you're going to need your zip gusset pieces and base in the exterior fabric, and then your zip gusset and base pieces in your lining fabric, your 2 strap tabs, and also your foam base stabilizer and zip gusset stabilizer. To start things off, just mark the centers on everything. It's going to make your life a lot easier as you go forward. We're going to start with an exterior zip gusset piece and your zip. And what we're going to do is put them right sides together and match the center marks. And then we're just going to clip those together. If you're confident putting your zips on afterwards, you can take them off now. It will make it easier to sew, and then we can fit them afterwards instead. So I'll show you how I do that in a bit. So I'm just going to baste that into place first of all. With that exterior piece still right side up, grab one of your lining pieces and you're going to place that on top. So your fabrics are now right sides together with the zip sandwiched between. And just match those up and clip them in place. And now we're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. To get a nice neat finish here, you could use a zip foot, but I prefer to use my standard presser foot, and I move the needle over so that the presser foot is right up against these zip teeth and the needle is as close as it can get to there. And that helps me sew a nice straight line because the presser foot guides me the whole way through. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to press these away from the zip. So we're pressing both fabrics. I'm not going to press this with an iron this time because this is like an oil skin exterior fabric and it will be ruined if I use an iron near it. We're going to top stitch this long edge and we're also going to sew these two short edges, but leave this long edge open. So with your zip right side up, you're going to take your other exterior piece and you're going to place that right sides together. So the right side is together with the right side of the existing fabric. And just clip that in place. Now we're just going to baste that. Now flip that over and place the final lining piece right sides together with the first one and clip that in place. And sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As you did on the other side, push the fabrics away from the zip. And clip them together. Now we're going to top stitch this long edge and just sew these two short edges. Now we're going to fit the stabilizer. So grab one piece and you're just going to slip it in between the exterior and the lining. Just push it right in there as far as it will go and then clip the edges together. Your stabilizer should be 1/2 inch in from each edge. Once it's in on both sides, you just need to baste these long edges closed. If you didn't put your zip pulls on earlier, now is the time to do it. So with this continuous zip tape, you just pull it open a little bit and you put the rounded edge of the zip pull on. And you just need to feed a little bit into each side. So as you do this, just check there's no bulges, but it's nice and even on both sides. Then you push down on the zip tape and you just pull your zip on. So we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So we've got two zips going toward each other. And just check that you haven't got like a bulge. If you've got a bulge going one way or the other, you just need to take one of them off and start again. Now grab your strap tabs from earlier and you should have a line that you marked on them. Mine's a little bit difficult to see, but it is there. What we're going to do is we're going to line up that with this edge here. So make sure that it's centered. And line that up and just clip it in place. So your rectangle ring is pointing in toward the zips. And we're just going to baste those on. For this step, I definitely recommend changing your needle. I increased mine at this point to a size 100. Okay, so check that the width here matches the width of your base. And if either of them are different, you can just trim them to match. I think, yeah, my base weirdly is a little bit bigger. This all depends on like the thickness of your fabrics and if you use the exact seam allowance and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to trim that to match, and I expect my lining is, yeah, also a little bit big. So I'll trim both of those to match before we attach them. Grab your exterior base gusset, place that right sides together. So this right side with the right side of the zip gusset, and just clip it on one short edge. And baste that edge with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Flip that over so you're looking at the lining and place your lining base right sides together and clip that on the same edge. We're going to sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and that rectangle ring is pretty close, so you might need to change to a zip foot to do this. If you do, you might find it easier to draw your seam allowance on. It just makes it slightly easier when you're sewing it to see exactly where it needs to be. Push the lining and the exterior away from the zip panel. So you just want to press this edge get a nice neat finish, and then I'm just going to clip this together. And we're going to top stitch this base edge with 1/8 inch seam allowance. So grab the other end of your exterior base and you're going to clip it together with the other short edge. Now you can baste that in place like we did with the other side, or if you want to, you can sew them both on at the same time if you're feeling more confident. As you did with the other side, you want to push the lining and exterior away from this seam that you just sewn. And then just clip them together. And we're going to top stitch this again with 1/8 inch seam allowance. So you'll notice that I don't trim my zip and my strap tabs back. So I leave them long in the seams like this. That's because I think it adds strength to the strap and the zip. But that's totally up to you. Now what we're going to do is clip one side of the base together. Once your lining and exterior are clipped together on one side, you're just going to baste that side. Now that side is sewn, you need to slip your stabilizer for the base in between the exterior and the lining. And where you've got your strap and zip overhangs, you want the foam to be between the exterior and those overhangs. That way they won't be visible on the outside of the bag. Once that side's clipped together, just baste it. Now your gusset is complete, you want to mark the centres. So what I'm going to do first of all is match these centres here and just clip it together. So I'm just matching these seams up. Now my fabric, it's just not any good at showing marks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip to show the centre instead. So if you just do a little snip like this, it creates a little V which shows then where the centre is. So do this on both sides and on the base. Now if you bring those base and top centre marks together and clip them together, then you can find your side centres as well. And just do the same thing to mark your side centres. Okay, so that's your gusset done. You can set that aside and move on to the next step. Step 5 is the lining pocket. For this step, you're going to need your slip pocket trim, your 2 slip pocket pieces, and one of your lining main panels. So we'll start first with these lining slip pocket pieces. I've marked both of them 1 inch up from the bottom, and then we're just going to fold that up to the line. So this is the bottom edge, and press. I'm going to take mine over to the iron and do the same thing with both of them. Once those are pressed, just place those right sides together and you make sure that the folded edge is matched up neatly. Now we're just going to sew the sides. Turn your pocket out and give it a good press to get it to lie nice and flat on the sides. Okay, so the bottom edge of your pocket is going to be the bit with the fold. So you can see that's looking pretty neat. And because of the method we've used, you've got like perfect corners. So now we need to fit the trim on the top edge. So first of all, check whether your trim fits. I have either done a terrible job with my seam allowances or with my cutting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this so it's exactly the same width as the pocket. And then I'm going to use some glue, or you could use double-sided tape if you prefer. And I'm going to wrap it around this top edge. Make sure that it meets perfectly on those edges. Once you're happy with that, you can just top stitch this open edge here with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. You now need to fit your slip pocket to the main panel. So I've marked my panel up from the bottom and I've marked the center. And I have also marked the center on my pocket, but it's very hard to see because of the black lines. So I'm going to try and line that up. And you can just make sure that it's equal on the two sides and that you're happy with the placement, that it's nice and straight. And then what you can do to hold it in place until you sew it is just fold it over and put a couple of clips on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take it over to the machine. I'm going to sew with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance starting on this top corner. And as I go, I'll just remove the clips so that I can unfold it and sew it in place. But they should then hold the rest of the pocket in place for me. For an optional extra step, you can fit a rivet, just slightly inset on the top corners of this pocket. So I'm just going to use this rivet template. Similar to magnetic snaps, I like to add a little bit of reinforcement behind my rivets. So I'm just going to put a rivet through there, through some Peltex, and then pop the cap on. I'll set those with my press and we'll move on to the next step. Step 6 is the lining zip pocket. For this step, you're going to need your zip pocket overlay or a zip pocket facing if you're not using an overlay. You're going to need your zip. You could use a number 3 or a number 5. For a number 5, you want to cut the box slightly bigger as written on the pattern piece. You're going to have your 2 zip pocket pieces and your main panel in lining. So if you're having a tag on the inside, you can just sew that in now. Now is a good time. And you also need to mark, as indicated in the pattern, and mark the center here. So we'll start with the zip pocket pieces. Place one of them right side up. Place the zip right side up on the top edge and just clip that in place. And sew that edge with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is just a little bit less than a 1/4 inch. So for this first zip pocket piece, you can see that my zip is closing to the left. Now I'm going to place the second pocket piece right side up. Again, this is the top edge if you have a directional fabric. And you're going to place the other side of the zip on top. So your zip is now closing to the right, and clip those together. And we're going to baste that with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you reach your zip pull, just leave your needle in, lift your presser foot up, and then you can slide your zip pull underneath the presser foot. Okay, so the wrong side of your zip should now be on the right side of your fabrics. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the iron and press this so that it's laying flat. So be really careful if you've got a metal zip, and also that you're not going to melt anything. What you can do if you prefer is just top stitch these edges down, which is a great option if you're using something like waterproof canvas. Once that's pressed, just set that aside for a moment and we're going to work on the zip pocket overlay. So if you're having the facing option, then you need to follow the instructions in the pattern instead. Now on the back of this overlay, I've put some double-sided tape. You can see it's where I'm going to stitch later. So when I'm sewing this, I'm going to use a Microtex needle because the tape doesn't stick to Microtex needles as well. So what I've done is I've marked the center just here, and I'm going to place this on that line with the center marks matched. Now I'm happy with that placement. I'm going to sew the outside edge. Now that's sewn on, I'm going to cut the fabric in the middle. And then what we need to do is flip it over and trim as much of the fabric out from the back as we can. So the double-sided tape, or if you use glue or whatever, is going to limit how far you can go. And you just want to trim it out as much as you can. Okay, so it doesn't need to be neat. You just need to make sure that it's not visible on this side. Now what I'm going to do is place my zip so that the pull is closing to the left, and we want this to go over the top like this. Now, I've done a really small box. You're supposed to enlarge your box for a number 5 zip, but I want to see, you know, how it looks like this. So I'm going to give this a try instead. What I'm going to do is use a little bit of double-sided tape. Actually, I might use a bit of fabric glue, top and bottom, so that it will stay in place. Let that dry for a minute, and then we're going to sew the rectangle here on the inside using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure your pockets are open when you're sewing this. Okay, so it's a nice tight zip. This is what happens when you use the 3/8 of an inch box with a number 5 zip. I kind of like it, and it's still nice and smooth. Okay, so turn that over and pull your top pocket piece down so that they are closed. And you'll notice that one of them is longer than the other. So I'm just gonna clip them together, and then I'm gonna trim the longer one to match. Now we need to close this pocket, so we're going to sew the side, the bottom, and up the other side. In order to do this, it's generally easier, although there's a little bit of glue there, if you pull the main panel away, and then you can sew down, across, and up the other side. So that's the zip pocket done. Now we can move on to the next step. Step 7 is final construction. For this step, you're going to need everything. So the first thing you want to do, if you haven't already, is mark the centers, top, bottom, and sides on all of your pieces. We'll start with the exterior cargo pocket and the lining slip pocket. We're going to place these wrong sides together, like so, and just clip them together. Once those are clipped together, we're going to baste around the sides and the bottom, but you're going to leave the top unsewn for now. Just a quick reminder, if you wanted to put like a logo tag or a handmade tag on your bag, you probably want to do it before this step, and you could sort of put it down here somewhere. So unclip your top, and what we're going to do is just slip the stabilizer in between. And then clip that top edge back together and baste that closed. Now that one's done, we're going to do the exact same thing with this other panel. So we're going to sew them together on the bottom and the sides, slip the stabilizer in, and then close it at the top. Okay, so that's our panels all assembled. Now we're really getting there. So we're going to start with the cargo pocket panel, because this is going to be the front of the bag, and sewing the curves isn't always the easiest thing. So we're going to start with the one that we want to look the best, because this side is going to be slightly easier to sew. So I've got all my centers marked everywhere. I'm going to match the top center mark on the zip to the center mark here, and we're putting them right sides together. And just add a couple of clips there. Okay, next we're going to match the base, and then you're going to match the sides. Once the sides and the top and base are clipped into place, we need to clip these curves, but you can see that it's a little bit too tight. That's because when we sew this with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're sewing a much smaller circumference, so the gusset needs to be smaller. So to get it to fit, what we're going to do is just snip into it no more than 1/4 of an inch. Once that curve is snipped, you can then clip it in place. So I'm just going to put a few more clips on. And what you do is you kind of stretch it around the curve, and having those snips in the gusset allows it to stretch. And by having this tighter gusset, it means that when we sew this with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, we're not going to get a ton of puckers on these corners. So go ahead and snip the rest of the curves and clip them into place. We're sewing this gusset on with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because later when we sew the binding on, we'll be using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and we don't want to go over the same stitching twice. When you're sewing this gusset on, you're going through a lot of layers, and on my machine I have to increase the tension to make sure that I get a nice finish with the stitching. This is different for everybody's machine though, so just kind of, depending what works for your machine. When I go around the corners I use an awl, and when I need to adjust I make sure that I leave the needle in so that I'm not going to lose my place and mess up the stitching. Okay, so now that's sewn on, just have a look, like poke all your corners out, check that you haven't got any big puckers or anything like that, because now's when you want to change it, not later. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. That was a little bit of a pucker there. I think I'm okay with that, because I think that will no longer be showing once we sew the binding on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so once you're happy with that, grab one of your pieces of binding. So we need to attach this double fold binding. In the written pattern you'll see that I used WPC instead, waterproof canvas, but I'm going to use double fold binding for this one. Now I like to start and finish my binding at the top because when you're looking into a bag you're not really looking at this bit, but you are looking at the base, so I figure it's best hidden at the top. So I'm going to clip that in place. Now this is how I personally do binding. I know a lot of people sew it on one side at a time. I much prefer sewing it on both sides at once. I just get a nice neat finish. It means less stitches, so it's not going to perforate the fabric if you're using like cork or vinyl. So I really like this method, but each to their own. Everybody can, figure out what works for you and see what you enjoy. But what I do is I clip this on. I'm going to sew it from the other side, so I'm clipping it on from this side. That way I can make sure right now that these stitches are completely covered and can't be seen. And then when I'm sewing it from the other side, I'll obviously be looking at it, so I'll know if my binding's not on perfect. So I'm going to do this around the whole of the bag. Once you're back at the start, just fold that raw edge over and clip it over the top of the starting place. Now we're ready to sew this on with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so have a look around the other side of your binding and you'll see just here, I just missed a bit here. I just full on missed a bit. My binding isn't actually the size it's supposed to be, which is a pain. So what I'm going to do is just sew back over that bit. And this is where using a matching thread is so helpful because you won't be able to see it at all. Before you go any further, just push your corners out and just check that all your curves are looking nice and neat, that there's no puckers around here. If there is, it's really up to you. You can either go back and fix them or, some people don't mind having a few puckers. And I know when I started out and my first few bags, there was tons of them. So I'm gonna leave that up to you. Now, I would recommend opening your zip if you haven't already, because it's just gonna make it easier for the next step. What we're gonna do is place this exterior sides together, and the same as we did on the other side, we're gonna match the top, bottom and side center marks first, clip those. Then you snip your gusset and clip the rest of the gusset in place. Once that's all clipped in place, you can sew that on with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Because of all the stabilizer in this bag, it's going to be kind of tough doing this side, so don't be afraid to just squish your bag and manipulate it to where you need it to be. And whenever you're maneuvering things, just remember to leave your needle in. Okay, so you're almost there. If you've got a label, watch out. I've actually already done this on one of my other bags, so you think I would have been more careful with this one, but there you go. That's what seam rippers are for. So I'm just gonna fix that. Okay, now again, as before, push, this is gonna be a bit more difficult from this side, but push all your corners out and check you haven't got any like major puckers or any problems really, because now's the time you wanna fix it before you put the binding on. And once you're happy with that, we're going to clip the binding on exactly like we did on the other side. So this is the moment of truth. You're going to turn it out and find out whether there's anything that needs redoing. Okay, so to get a nice neat finish, you can actually push your binding toward the gusset. It kind of gives it a nicer finish. So I'm just going to spend a second doing that. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I mean, there's a possibility of a couple of puckers there where which I should have, probably should have redone it earlier, but I thought it was going to get lost in the seam and it didn't. But that is it. Other than that, I'm really happy with how that's turned out. So the last thing that I need to do is attach the strap. Okay, so with your bag facing up, so the cargo pockets, facing up, you're going to come from the top and go through this rectangle ring. And then what you need to do is come back over the top of this center bar. Okay, just make sure it's not twisted or anything. And then what you're going to do is put it up through this rectangle ring. And I'm just going to clip that in place. Now you can either sew this on your sewing machine, or for me, I'm going to fit 2 rivets right there to hold it in place. And there you have it. The finished bag turned out really nice, and it's great as an everyday bag. Thanks so much for joining us for this tutorial, and we hope to see you again soon.